The headlines all say the same thing. Bank of England increased base rate to 4%. Another raise in interest rates aimed at tackling the persistent issue that is inflation in this country. Now, at first glance, in the report that we're going to look at together, you might get the impression that we're near the end of this cycle, that the Bank of England has figured out how to get inflation under control and they've done enough. But within the data contained within the report, there are some worrying trends that I've spotted that we need to discuss today. The report came out today, so I'm reacting to it quickly because I want to give you context beyond just the headlines that you see everywhere. But that means that I've had to pick out the key areas of the report that I think impact us the most. And the full report is listed below. As well as that, I'm going to section everything off with timestamps for you in the description, and they should appear. You can just skip to the sections that you think are relevant to you. But I want to start by looking at inflation, and I'd just encourage everyone who's watching to at least listen to this bit. In November, the Bank of England predicted inflation would peak and then it would start to fall away. On screen are those predictions. Now, they've revised those predictions, and on face value, it's good news. Instead of 10.1% for Q1, they're saying 9.7%. Q2 of this year has gone from 9.5 to 8.5. And this continues with the forecast for the rate of inflation being over 1% lower to that in November. Now, while I'm sure Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are going to take full credit for this drop in inflation, with their whole nuclear power plants and coffee cups plan, the Bank of England put it down to headline inflation will continue to fall as pressures from energy and other external costs ease. Great news. The external forces that are driving inflation globally are subsiding, but they continue. Domestic and potentially more persistent inflationary pressures are likely to remain strong over the next few quarters, and it's uncertain how quickly and to what extent they will abate. So the Bank of England are saying things are getting better, but there's these things in the UK at the minute that are sort of driving inflation, and we're not really sure how bad they're going to get. So what are these factors? Now, in order to answer that question, we need to understand that the total inflation rate that hits the headlines is a combination of the changes in price of a load of goods and services. It's possible for the rate of inflation to fall overall, say due to energy prices dropping, while other components of the inflation data still rise in price. We're seeing exactly this at the moment, and this graph shows it. Core goods inflation is falling, but at the same time, the rate of inflation in core services is going up a lot. Now, this is important. Goods are tangible things, like a car is a good. Services, you can't really touch them, like legal advice. I mean, you could touch your solicitor if you want, but you're probably going to end up in court for another reason than you want to be. Now, the UK is a service-based economy. The service industry is accounted for 79% of the total UK economic output. So while the rate of inflation is indeed falling overall, it's concerning that the prices of services, the thing that this country does the most, are still going up at an increasing rate. The Bank of England says the reason for this is that service-based inflation is due to wage growth. People want to be paid more so their spending power can keep up with inflation, but remember that quote, domestic and potentially more persistent inflationary pressures. The UK is in danger of entering a wage-based inflation spiral, and that's not good. So before this, inflation was due to the price of goods costing more, mainly due to supply chain issues, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The price of goods that we bought rose, so as a result, everyone went to their bosses and went, I need a pay rise so that my standard of living can stay where it is. And companies go, okay, we'll give you the pay rise, but what we'll do to accommodate for that is we'll put prices up on the other side. People then go, hold on, well, now I need another pay rise. And then what happens is the company gives them the pay rise and prices go up again. And we get this doom loop of ever increasing wages and prices. Service-based inflation is now at a 30-year high. This speaks directly to the impact of rising wages, as the key cost to service-based businesses is their staff. Wage growth is currently higher than forecasted in November, and the UK labour market remains stretched. With a shortage of staff, all of this is pushing wages higher, which is inflationary. So while the headlines might read that inflation is falling and that the Bank of England is ahead of its forecast for inflation coming down, the detail is really important here, because the core services inflation and the rate at which wages are growing really needs to be monitored, because inflation as a result of wage growth is going to be much trickier to tackle long term, as it gets really hard to break that cycle. But for now, the Bank of England seems sure that inflation will fall significantly over the next 12 months, and the tone of this report is that we won't see many more interest rate rises from here. Let's now talk about these interest rate rises. The Bank of England have stated their expectation is to raise the bank rate to 4.5% by mid-2023, and that the rate will then fall from there to 3.25% by 2026. So that would mean maybe 1 or 2 more rate hikes before we hit peak or terminal rate. But for those hoping for rates to suddenly and quickly drop away from there, The forecast of them falling to 3.25% in 3 years after, I think, is an admission from the Bank of England that they're likely going to need to keep and hold rates at 4.5% for a prolonged period of time, as a way to really combat the persistent inflation forces we just discussed. But it does give some food for thought for those of you who are looking for some certainty around, mortgage rates and where they might likely go in the coming years, and help with the question of, should I be locking in a long-term rate? The Bank of England is forecasting a decline in the bank rate long term. There is a discussion around mortgages and property prices in this report. I don't want to focus on this because really all it is an aggregation of data that I've already discussed in other videos about the property market, but they are discussing here how mortgage rates have fallen. Rates on new mortgages have declined since the November report, but they remain materially higher than a year ago. Average quoted rates on 2-year fixed rate 90% and 75% loan-to-value mortgages stood at 6% and 5.4% in December. They then talk about trends in the wider property market, saying that the numbers of mortgages available have continued to recover since loads were pulled from the market due to Liz Truss's mini-budget. But the latest credit conditions survey from the CCS suggests that availability of secured lending to households declined in Q4, with lenders expecting a further fall in Q1. This partly reflected perceptions of a deterioration in the economic outlook and a reduced risk appetite. The report and the data within it echoes the mainstream sentiment that house prices are likely going to fall over the next year. And really, that's all down to decreased affordability as a result of rising interest rates. So logic stands that further rises in the rate from the Bank of England is going to suppress house prices further, especially if they need to hold that rate at a high level for an extended period of time. Okay, so besides inflation, the one thing that I'm most interested in from this report is the forecasts around GDP, as really that speaks to the health of the economy overall. In November, they were forecasting the longest recession on record, a 2-year recession. On screen is that forecast from November. The dark blue band here is where they felt GDP would go, and you see it sits in the negative over 2023 and 2024. Now, we actually had some positive data recently off the back of increased spending due to things like the World Cup. I mean, never underestimate the UK's ability just to drink away its problems. But like hair of the dog on a hangover, you just kind of kick the bucket down the road, and a recession seems inevitable at this point. But the latest forecasts think it won't be as bad as they first predicted in November. Here is that latest forecast, and if I flip between the two, you'll see this is subtle, but the Bank of England are forecasting a lower decline in GDP growth over that period. Now, a smaller decline in GDP is good news if it pans out that way. But I also want to point out that the International Monetary Fund thinks that the UK will be the only one of these major economies not to grow in the next couple of years. That even includes Russia, who are subject to heavy sanctions. So this is nothing to celebrate. It's just not as bad as we originally thought, mainly due to factors outside of the UK's control. But the Bank of England thinks that GDP is expected to fall 0.5% in 2023 and 0.25% in 2024. If I was to summarise this report, I would say the tone is that things are not as bad as we thought back in November, but there are some threats that still exist, namely the rise of inflation in services that could hint of further issues to come. The headlines will say it's a shorter recession. The politicians will say falling inflation helps with the cost of living. But the reality is, yes, wholesale energy prices have fallen, but the lifting of the cap in a couple of months means many of us will actually see our bills increase. And yes, 4% inflation, which is what the Bank of England are forecasting by the end of 2023, is better than 10%. But that's still a 4% rise in prices compared to the year before. That's still stuff being 4% more expensive than it was at the end of 2022. These forecasts might predict a better economic outlook than in November, but the reality is on the ground for many of us, we're going to see costs rising around us still. And the only way to combat that is to take a hit financially or to earn more money. But we know what that feeds into, don't we? Wage-based inflation that the rising service inflation figures are hinting at. Things are still in the balance here, and we're not out of the woods yet. I think what's crucial here is the next report. What will be the core service inflation numbers, and what will they look like? I will, of course, look at this in a couple of months when the data comes out, but always just remember in times of economic slowdown or recession, it's all just about getting through it unscathed. That means don't carry large, high-interest debt balances and just have a good emergency fund set aside in case you find yourself out of work. If at this point you need cheering up, look, I get it. You should probably watch this video next. I think it might be the best video I've ever made, or at least that's what people are saying in the comments anyway. And regardless of all this data and forecasts and GDP and all of that, This video will just make you realise you're doing great.